you go back to your academic partner, who's a brilliant researcher in textiles, and you say to him, well, this is what the guys are interested in. And he says, well, no problem, I'll talk about that. You invite him to the meeting, and then you ask him beforehand, you say, well, you know, do you have a copy of your presentation? Are you on topic? He says, no, but don't worry, it'll be okay. And he shows up on the day, and he says, I was asked to talk about A, but I'm going to talk about B. And it's a disaster. This is it. The theory and the practice is always two different things. And so you have to go through these cycles of making mistakes, really, before you get good at it. So the stakeholders, these pre-foresight phases, really important, where you go around and talk to people individually, and say, well, what do you need to do? I have other examples later on. In the case of Bosnia, in the case of Montenegro, when we were doing the skills foresight, it was relatively straightforward. We had parliamentarians and people in ministries who were very supportive of the activity, and they knew the politics, and they could help us managing the stakeholders. In the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, though, it was a whole other story. We started at the top. We had this bizarre meeting with, imagine you're a team of 2 people, and you go into a big room, and there's 30 people. So the room is, long like that, and there's a long table, and there's 30 people on the table, and there's a really angry-looking lady in the middle, and you're 2 people on the other side. You don't even move. What's all this about? And you say, oh, we're here, and it says, what the hell is all this about? And they're rude, and they use rude language, and they insult you, and stuff like that. That can happen. But you just have to, you have to find the right entry points. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes it's less right, etc. But actually, in the case of Bosnia, we totally, in Montenegro, we were able to start at the top, and they helped us navigate everything. In Bosnia, we had to start at the bottom. I don't know if you know much about Bosnia, but there's 120 ministries. It's a federation of 3 entities. One of the entities is called the Republic of Serbia. Serbia is a different country, but one of the parts of Bosnia is called the Republic of Serbia. And then you have the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina is 1/2 of the country of Bosnia. And they have 10 cantons, and they all have all the ministries. And one of the ministries of education sued the federal ministry for proposing initiatives. Said, you have no constitutional right to propose any initiatives, we don't recognize your legitimacy. So that was the context in which we started. But by navigating it carefully, we ended up with legislation that went through Parliament, etc. All of that in less than a year. Everybody thought it would be impossible, but because it was done skillfully, we were able to pull it off. So Hassan, this was the right question, but there isn't a simple answer. So you have to be aware that the stakeholders are a very homogeneous bunch, and you have to construct the initiative. Carefully, start small, and build out from there. And it's not, you need to have an insight at the beginning of where you want to go. You need to be politically astute and knowledgeable, as well as technical, to do well, and that's not always an easy thing to have. Do you know this guy? Have you seen this character?
No.
You didn't see him on a poster in a post office someplace? Wanted for foresight. Well, we did a Mediterranean foresight activity a number of years ago. It was called Inframed, and this is one that involved several countries in the region. I want to mention this because there were a couple of things that came out. The tools we used included road mapping, etc., objectives and goals, partnerships. One of the techniques that we use in foresight is something called success scenarios. You probably know what scenarios are. You might have done scenarios. But very often, scenarios pop up in the context of scenario planning. And scenario planning is a very negative thing. Scenario planning is what happens if the NATO bombs Libya? What is the impact on Tunisia? So usually you start from difficult disaster situations. That's scenario planning. And you do it in advance, hopefully, so that the day something happens, you're better prepared. And people forget that success also, you need to plan for success. So if you're an ambitious person, some people planning for success means, oh, I'm rich, what car will I buy? That's planning for success. But we have a different type of planning for success, and that is, maybe it has to do with success is having good relations with industry or having a healthy budget and being able to invest in research. So in that case, what do I ask for? If we have a good budget surplus, what can we ask for that would be good for research and innovation, etc.? Do we have a plan and a budget, etc.? So that's like planning for success. But the idea is that in scenario planning, usually people are planning for some kind of a failure, trying to anticipate a failure. But here in foresight, we're usually planning for success. And so there's a whole set of techniques that you can use: alpha outlooks, beta outlooks, delta outlooks, etc. That's a methodology. We don't need to go into that in much detail. But in looking at the sector, the olive oil sector, one of the things that popped out was that we saw that research in this sector is very good. People are registering new plant varieties, and there's some patenting going on, there's publishing of papers, etc. But when we looked at, but this reasoning is good in an academic setting. If you're in an economic setting, you want to ask, is our research, is it intense enough to transform the sector? So one of the goals that was mentioned was, getting new varieties of olive trees that would grow in areas where they don't grow now, where current varieties are not well adapted. That means there's probably hundreds of thousands of hectares or millions of hectares of land that you could use as productive farmland if you had these varieties. So the question was, how long does it take, on average, to produce a new variety? And when we did the calculation, we found out that, statistically, we're not going to have enough of an impact because there's not enough research going on, that the scale of the research is enough to do good science, but it's not enough to provide enough new varieties of plants to transform the agricultural landscape and bring into use, transform the economy of whole sectors of the country. And we asked the questions, and basically you have 10 stations, 2 hectares each, 30 researchers, and this looks very good when you evaluate it from a traditional scientific point of view. But if you do the calculations and say, how many tens of thousands of hectares extra will we plant with olive trees, you find out that actually we really need to scale this up. And I think, did I have the scaling? It was something like a factor of 10, something like that. If we really want to have an impact on the economy, instead of having 10 stations with 2 hectares each, you need maybe 10 stations with 20 hectares or something like that. You need a much more intensive, bigger scale research activity. So that was one of the interesting takeaways from this Infomed activity that we did. And it drew the line between research, which is good academically for training people and generating new knowledge, and research, which is applied, that's intended to transform the sector. When you do foresight, you do lots of lists, and there's a logistics issue. When you do brainstorming, how do you gather the ideas? How do you organize them? There's lots of techniques for doing that. If we had a little bit more time, we could do some simulations, etc. But we're a little bit pressed for time today. We won't do it. Maybe in another context, it might be useful to go into this level of detail. But this is just to give you an idea of the type of results that were coming out. You'll see, one of the things that you see in this is that some ideas are very well developed, other ideas are very fluffy and not so well developed. This is part of the process. You have to take the time to gather the ideas and then develop them sufficiently, dealing with redundancy and overlap and everything. And you need some kind of technically minded person who is able to put a structure in all of that, to synthesize things in an intelligent way, in a useful way. And that's a skill, you know. The first time you do it, it's not easy. You get better at it with practice, and obviously some people are better at it than others. You know? But if you're doing foresight, you need to look out for the people who have great capacity to synthesize things in a useful and user-friendly way. So yeah, typically you do brainstorming, 67 drivers in an hour. You know, you have a group, they have post-its. You can, you know, work with things like this. If you don't have that, you can do it against the wall. You can go around the table and sort it on the table. Usually people do notes, and then you try to physically arrange them, etc. So it's a bit, people get to stand up and walk around, and that's nice as well, better than sitting down all the time. But these are, you know, elements of the management of a foresight activity that you get better with practice, and you have to make choices as you go along. Sometimes you have a workshop to do, and you know to do it well you need 2 days. But then everybody says, no, we're only available for 1 day. The day after is a holiday, or everyone's gone on holidays, or something like that. We have a fire drill, or whatever. The president is visiting. Always something. And so then you have to adapt your method from a 2-day ideal method, and you have to see, how can we do the best we can in 1 day? You know, so you need to be a little bit creative and flexible in using your methods. And sometimes, if you don't have the time to act through the group, it means you have to do the preparation. So you do preparation in advance, people get documents in their hands, and rather than generating the data in 1 day, they validate it, you know, that they get something that they can discuss and read about, etc. But this is the technology, so to speak, of doing foresight. And now we're talking about the vision for skill stuff. I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly now because I know you need a bit of a rest. But the skills thing was a very interesting thing. It was an innovation for the European Commission. You had these countries that were going to join the European Union, and they have problems with unemployment, they have problems with labor, etc. And you want them to advance as much as possible in dealing with those problems before they join. And in providing assistance in terms of programs, you need to have an idea of what assistance do they need, what programs do they need. So this was the context, was to help them prepare so that the country was in a better position to tell the European Union what programs, these are our problems, these are the programs we need, give us 200 million euros, etc., over 5 years to solve it. So this was the context. So just, if you think, when we started, people had the opinion that really the question is, you know, what skills do we need in 2020? But this is the wrong question. What we were really talking about was the skills system. Because whatever skills we think are needed in 2020, in a couple of years' time, we're going to change. You know, we will change, we will refine our thinking about that. So it's not so much, you know, what is the list, the shopping list, but how do you arrive at that shopping list? So that education, training, institutes, etc., can adjust what they're doing, so that career guidance officers, etc., employment agencies can change their strategy and their work. So the big issue was what needs to be done to the system so that the system is more reactive rather than shopping list of what jobs will people do in 2020. But this was a big discussion at the beginning, and the idea of working on the system, you know, wasn't a natural one for everybody, especially because the system is quite complex and nobody was in the habit of thinking in systemic terms. So again, there's the whole general structure. You know, this is pre-foresight, recruitment. This was the question that Hasna asked there, is about the recruiting, contacting people, and then you get into the real foresight. You know, sectoral capacities and a shared vision for the sector, etc. There's the follow-up. In other words, what kind of programs, etc., do we need to implement? And this was the timeline. We had 6 months in which to do this job with Montenegro. Yes. By the way, all of you guys can ask questions. Don't be shy.
My last question was about the pre-foresight phase. Now it's about the foresight exercise.
Yeah.
You said in the last slide that recruitment of stakeholders.
Yeah.
What are the criteria to include this? And why do you call it recruiting stakeholders? And the other question is, generally, like you said, you have some resistance.
Yeah.
You have some people who are always angry about everything. Or people who have their own way of thinking and they are resistant to change this way of thinking. What to do with these people?
Well, the first thing is that you can't shoot them. This is one of the things you say in English, you can't shoot them. But it's a question of degree. Everybody resists change. It's a practical issue. You cannot live always changing. You're always changing. If you're an investor, for example, in the energy sector, some people, NGOs, they get frustrated because there are all these power stations that are running coal. Well, you can't just shut them down, because they were a big investment, they employ people, etc., and they provide energy, which is needed for growth. And you might agree that coal is a bad way for generating electricity, but you can't shut them down until the power from coal has justified the investment, until you've covered the costs, etc. And then later, perhaps, when it's ready to be decommissioned, you have a choice. Do I replace it with another coal station or with something else, photovoltaic or a nuclear station or whatever? So the world is complicated, but very often when you talk about change, people interpret it in a black and white way. So if I'm talking about coal and there's a coal guy in the room, he's going to get very angry because it's his job. He feels as though we're going to shut down the coal station tomorrow. But it might take 20 years before it will be shut down. And in the meantime, he has lots about he might be retired or he'll move on and do something else. But people have this irrational reflex, to resist change. And everybody does. Everybody, even the most creative people you can think of, everybody does to some extent. But but again, it's a different degree for different people, and on some subjects, one person will react negatively, on a different subject, somebody else will. What can you do? Well, the main thing is to establish rules of engagement. And the rules of engagement are people are invited, they are asked to contribute, and they're asked to do this in a professional and respectful manner. And that's really all, And of course, there is the issue that, again, I said, you have to be careful who you invite when. If I'm talking about energy, the last thing that I'm going to do, the last people I will probably invite are, NGOs that are against, coal, etc. Because you have to know them. Maybe they will play a constructive role, or maybe they will just block everything and stop all possibility of constructive dialogue. So you have to, when you invite people in, you have to do it carefully. It's good to have little workshops. You test people out in the little workshops. You see, are they willing to play a constructive role? This is the most important thing. Are people able to play a constructive role? Again, if you have somebody who is a financer or a program manager or whatever, and they're totally against it, that's a different story. Maybe you have to decide not to do it in that case. If you know that in doing it, you're never going to be able to go beyond having the report. Your time might be better spent elsewhere. But there's always this, this is the politics of the game. Anytime, ultimately, you probably want to mobilize money, you probably want to mobilize people, you're going to occupy a space as a leader, etc. People will be jealous of that, people will resent it, some people will naturally, some people would block a cure for cancer, because it's not them. These are just personalities. But in general, if you construct things in the right way, you have a good chance of winning people over. And there are cases where it just doesn't happen. Like imagine if you were working with the president of North Korea, or Idi Amin Dada, or there are people out there, and you just don't make progress with them, and you have to decide which are the battles worth fighting.
I think that's the question.
I saw your hand up. You thought I was going to shoot you. I was talking about shooting, and you thought you were.
We're talking about connecting ideas using tools such as brainstorming.
Yeah.
These ideas will be classified, but the question is how to choose the brain ideas or the ideas that we will build our prediction in 30 years or in 20 years after.
Now that's a very good question as well. And this is why you need to be patient, because if you're leading a brainstorming session, you probably have some ideas of your own, and other people will bring ideas, and you might or might not agree with them. But that doesn't matter. You have to, if you're leading a session, you have to, you have to remove yourself from it. Because in the end, the whole activity is for the other people, it's to help the other people better understand the future and how it's changing, etc., and the options that are available. And so in this first phase, generally you suspend judgment. You don't judge. You just make lists. Whatever anybody says, it goes down on the list. And maybe some of the things you think are crazy. You don't see the relevance, but you leave it on the list. Somebody else thought it was important, and so later on they can come back and explain, and they might decide that you might suddenly see its importance later on, or maybe you might see that, well, it wasn't important after all. But imagine you have a list of 60 things. You can't manage with 60 things, You have to find ways of reducing this, maybe to priorities, etc. But that then is something that you discuss with people. You discuss together, you do voting, there are different ranking techniques, there are complex tools, multi-criterion decision tools. There are a lot of different ways of doing it. And I think sometimes you can plot the ideas on an axis, and you could have urgent versus important. And then everybody kind of votes, and then you end up putting the idea someplace in one of the four squares, Things that are very urgent or not urgent, things that are important, not important, and then you decide, okay, let's work with what's urgent and important. It doesn't have to be urgent, important. It could be, on short-term, long-term, fundamental applied. There are lots of ways of dividing up the world in, simple ways. But a one-dimensional way is just a list, and you vote on the best, and you end up with a linear ranking. When you have these two axes, you have a two-dimensional ranking, and you can have 3 and 4 dimensions, etc., depending on the criteria. But there you need the support from some kind of software tools. And there are many, many different ways of doing it. Voting, for example, you have a list. I could put the list here on the table, and I give everybody 2 Post-its. And you go along and you put the 2 Post-its against the 2 ideas that are the most important for you. And then you count up the total number of Post-its, and you can use that as a way of ranking things. But there are many different ways of doing this. And the general idea is that whatever way you use, you end up with a set of priorities, and then you have a discussion, and you say, well, does that look right? Maybe we're missing something. This is not an exact science, but the idea is that maybe out of the 90 ideas, you come up, everybody agrees that there's really 3 or 4 ideas that are the most important, and so let's work with those in the future. But again, it's with practice and it depends on the size of the group. You can do it online with 1,000 people, you can do it in a room with 5 people. You know, there are so many different ways for doing it. Maybe that will be a homework question for you to list the different ways for ranking. I just showed you kind of a couple of structures. When we were in Bosnia, the way we structured it, we only had time to do 3 workshops, you know, and we had to spend a lot of time doing exploratory visits because the country was so complex and nobody would agree. Nobody would sit in a room with each other. You know, we really had problems from that point of view. So we went around talking to a lot of people to find, you know, ideas about what's important for everybody and under what conditions we could bring them all into the room. And then when we thought we had something that was pretty close to it, we had to use the Prime Minister's office, the EU delegation, you know, we had to use a lot of diplomacy to get the Prime Minister to issue instructions, to get people to come to meetings. When they had the instructions, they came to meetings. And generally, actually at that point, it started to get very constructive and people worked well together. And we ended up with a text that passed through Parliament. And just to give you an idea of the complexity that we were dealing with, in the skills system, in this pre-foresight phase, we had to do some background work, gathering all of the policies that were somehow relevant to skills. And I think in this case it was 41 policies that we came up with. And we kind of classified them, you know, policies that had to do with the labor market, the economy, education, training and learning, etc. Some policies were mature and had budgets, other policies were just idea papers. But we ended up with finding 41 documents, and really the whole exercise was when we saw these documents, we found that lots of things were missing. There was lots of redundancy, things repeated, there were lots of important things that were missing. But anyway, that was our starting point for looking at the system. We looked at all of the policies that concerned the system, and, you know, SWOT activities, we had to adapt this because very often people, you know, SWOT is not easy. It sounds simple, but it's not easy to do it in a useful way. So we had to give orientations, and here I mentioned methods for listing and ranking, you know, the one-dimensional, two-dimensional, 3. The 3 one is, you know, multi-dimensional methods. There are lots of those. And I'm just going to run through this a little bit. At the very end, we had something called, you know, an action plan, because it was a vision for 2020, and we had our success scenarios and vision. We knew where we wanted to be at 2020 in the end, but here we are today. So the big question, what do we do tomorrow? You know, what do we do tomorrow? Because if we aren't clear on that, it'll all be a waste. We will not move down the path, down the road of implementing the vision. So this was an important thing, was to organize a road mapping activity to help us go beyond the vision and move towards action. Did you put your hand?
Thank you. Actually, I have a question about during the foresight workshop or exercise, beside the brainstorming and getting the idea and the planning, etc., etc., is there any real work on the actual situation? Because you can't build the future if the present is already messy. So are they the same people working on the future plans? They work at the same time to fix the actual problems, or if it's another organization or other people's, how do you coordinate with them to reach your goal?
Well, this again is a very good question. I would say that you know, these are very practical issues, because you can have a theoretical idea of what you would like to do, your plan, your project plan, your workshops, who will attend, etc. But then reality happens, you know. So, and you just have to do the best you can with that. the whole reason that we were having this exercise is because we believed there was a need for coordination. You know? So if there was all of this coordination, it would have been much easier to do. And you mentioned, you know, like the present. The present is always where you have to start from. You always have to start from the reality, the programs that already exist, the people who already exist, etc. That's your starting point. And maybe, like in the technology action plan that we're doing for Chagas right now, it's finished this weekend and it'll be published in March. But within that action plan, we've identified the coordination activities that will be needed in the future. For example, Internet of Things, you've heard of that?
I work on it.
Okay, you work on it. But in agriculture, you talk about Internet of Farm Things, and also Internet of Everything, because you have sensors in nature, not just in the machines, but in nature for water, the movement of cows, etc. It's not just smart machinery, but it's nature that gets connected up to this Internet of Farm Things. And we had guys from IBM that were talking to us about, you know, their technology vision and how things would work out. We had Intel, we had Analog Technologies, we had the National Nanotechnology company called Tyndall, etc. And all of these guys were saying, listen, this is a really exciting area, you know, but we don't know who to work with. And they were asking for coordination. So it's kind of a gift in a sense, you know, that at least in the IT sector, you have these giant companies who would like to use Ireland as a test bed to develop new service and product concepts that they will export to the world. So that is great news for us. In other areas, it's less obvious, you know, who needs to coordinate. One of the things that comes up is the idea of microbiota. Do you know what a microbiota is? You know when you eat a yogurt and it has bifidus in it? Bifidus, the idea is that in your stomach there's all these microorganisms. So digestion is not just a chemical thing. You know, there's also microorganisms working in your stomach. And this is what you call these the microbiota. And this is called the second genome. So you have your individual genetics, and you have the genetics of the organisms in your stomach, the microbiota. And so you have whole genome sequencing, and there's a whole technology that's helping us understand how to manage better, like going beyond bifidus, etc. Cows to improve their production, conversion of grass into milk, emissions of methane for the greenhouse gases, etc. So we're beginning to understand those things now. In the case of Internet of Things, we have lots of people who want to collaborate. I guess it's the culture in IT. But in the genetics and the natural sciences, it's much less obvious. We know there's a need to cooperate, but the demand is not as powerfully expressed, maybe because there's more silos, in the life sciences area. But in any case, these are, one of the things that comes out of the foresight often is knowledge about who you need to work with, and some kind of discussion about how can we coordinate in the future to move on this agenda. The partnering was a very important element to come out of the foresight. So it's not just choosing technologies. That was the old idea, choosing technologies. Now it's who do you work with to develop it, especially into services, that will make the technologies accessible to farmers and other people at a reasonable price. So we don't have the answer at the end, but what we have done is we've made a very good argument as to why we need to coordinate, why we should look at this area, why it's important for the future, and why we need to work out a way, why we need to get organized for it. And the first step next year will be a working group or a task force on this area to work out partnership arrangements and stuff like that. Any other questions? I'm going to kind of wrap up quickly on this because I don't want to. This is just the Chagas. You'll get all of this stuff eventually, and also if you want to come back to me by email and ask a question, feel free. I mightn't answer immediately because I'm often a little bit busy, but I'll do my best. And this is the vision of the agri-food value chain in the future. On the one hand, you have services, vets, machinery providers, the farmers, primary processors, abattoirs, etc., secondary processors, distributors, consumers. So you have this physical movement of goods more or less in this direction. You know, this is the physical value chain. But the vision for the future is data, all of these huge amounts of data that will be coming backwards from the consumer to the processors, etc., all the way to the producers and their service providers. Big data, genomic data. To give you an idea, Ireland is working on the genetic sequence of its 1 million cows. We have 1 million cows and beef cattle. We're sequencing all of those. In 3 years, we have all of those sequences covered. And at the same time, we need to look at the performance of the animals, their health events, their performance, their weight, their production, all that kind of stuff. And looking at, we do the data mining and the machine learning because there's so much data, we need to use artificial intelligence on it. But it's all of this data here, that's what's going to enable next generation products and services, etc. We'll talk about it a little bit later on. And the elephant in the room is technology transfer. Our system is not transferring technology quickly enough to the farmers, so we really need to modernize and update this. I'm sure you all know this curve, this is the technology adoption curve. It was discovered 100 years ago in the context of farming. I used to call it the corn curve. And recently it was kind of rediscovered by Geoffrey Moore and people like that in the Silicon Valley context. And we want to go from a curve that's like this, where adoption is very, very long and takes 10 years, to one like this, where adoption is much, much quicker. And the final thing, so basically, some of the technologies, that I'm going to talk about afterwards, you might say, well, this is not of interest to Tunisia. Well, it might be of interest to Tunisia's competitors. So this is what you need to remember. You might say, well, we're not ready to implement, Internet of things and stuff like that. But other people are, and they will be your competitors. So this is the thing you need to keep, in the back of your mind. And so, how does all of this reasoning about technology affect competitive positioning of Tunisia, etc.? And these kind of questions, what does it mean for the reindustrialization of Tunisia? Just making contact with what we've been talking about before. I'm going to stop there. Let's take a little break. We have another hour left. Can we take 10 minutes? And then we come back, and then we'll talk about technology and reasoning about technology and thinking through some of these trends. That'll give you a bit of a flavor of the kind of stuff that goes on in some of these meetings in force. So, thank you for listening.
Thank you.
You write the software, and it's shared, and people look at it, and they discover mistakes, and they improve it. And this whole dynamic of communities of people, each incrementally improving the design of the software. Now, a lot of the really important software in the world is open source software. The software that runs servers and email systems, etc. A lot of it is open source software. Now here we have open source hardware. And it's almost the same thing in the sense that we're not talking about the object, but the design of the object, the file that holds the design of the object. It's really a piece of software. So in that sense, open source hardware, open source software, it's not very different. But it's only recently that the possibility of open source software has become available. And so Thingiverse is a place where people who are interested in this, they share files, and you have the same dynamic. I put up a file, people say, oh, that's cool, and they modify it in some clever way. And they post it again, and you have communities incrementally modifying things until you produce something that's highly complex, highly functional, but it's available for anybody who wants. So this is the Thingiverse, and it really has changed stuff. Now, when I started looking into this, one of the things I did is I asked my friends, hey, anybody doing 3D printing? And a friend of mine who made an Arduino-driven, guitar controller, he was now printing out model airplanes. And so I went to his place, and he showed me, his room and all the stuff that he was doing. And he was able to tell me, about the experience of 3D printing. It's interesting that these small hobby printers, when you print out, they extrude plastic into a shape, but sometimes they make mistakes. They should extrude a blob and it doesn't come out. And sometimes you can get a bit of a mess and you have to start again, reprint it. So this is one of the frustrations. People always show you the nice objects that they create, but in the very low cost stuff that's available, there are some frustrations involved in that. But having said that, lots of people are doing research on this, and reliable industrial systems are coming out that print things much bigger, much more complex, much quicker, much more accurately. For example, when you print stuff out, maybe a print takes a day. Well, if you have 100 things to print out, you don't take 100 days printing one after another. You have software algorithms that pack the 100 objects into a single print. So rather than just printing one thing, you print 100 things out of in the one batch. So that speeds up by 100. You have the print head. Well, you can use lots of print heads. You can have 10 print heads zipping up and down, at the same time. So there are lots of ways, on the one hand, improving the mechanics of the print head, improving the qualities of the kind of ink that goes through it, and improving, the strategies for actual printing. So you get speed-ups, and once you get those speed-ups, you're no longer talking about a hobby tool. You're talking about something that is very quickly converging on what you can do in full-scale manufacturing systems. What's frightening for some people is, this is an object, and it was printed by an 11-year-old girl. This is quite a complex object. Now, all she did probably was just download it from Thingiverse or whatever and print it out. Maybe she made some modifications to it. But the point is that you don't need to master complex tools. You don't need to master precision engineering or whatever to produce complex objects like this. Starting from Thingiverse and the open hardware revolution, even, a little 11-year-old girl working home, etc., she can print out and manufacture something that's really quite complex and would have challenged the greatest craftsman or artist or whatever to produce using traditional techniques. So I did a study for the European Parliament last year. They have in the Parliament, there's a committee called STOA, the Science and Technology Options Assessment. And what they do is they prepare briefs for parliamentarians. And the whole idea of this brief is to inform people in the parliament about things that seem complex at first sight, like 3D printing. So you read an article in the paper, or there's a piece of legislation about 3D printing, the parliamentarian needs to know what's this about. They need to be briefed so that they can vote in Parliament on legislation or participate in the work of standing committees and stuff like that. So the way the brief was put to me is, okay, we've done a lot of work, we know a lot about 3D printing, but when are we going to manufacture a 3D printed car? That was the question that was put to me 2 years ago. So I very quickly, first thing you do, what would you do if somebody said that to you? First thing you do? Go to Google, exactly. You put in 3D printed cars, etc. So I did this and I found there's loads of guys already trying to do it, and they were pretty close to the mark. So I put alerts on things and start following these trends. That's generally the first thing you do when you're asked to analyze something about technology. And so the first thing to realize is that if you take a traditional car, how is it manufactured? Well, this is not a high-end car, but you can see it has a lot of components. If you were to take an advanced car made by BMW or somebody like that, 25,000 components, that's the order of complexity of the machine. 25,000 components. And all of those, ultimately you have sub-assemblies, the braking system, etc., the engine, so that the car is broken down into like subcomponents, and all the bits that go into this, they're manufactured, and you might even end up at the end of the chain having workshops in Mexico, hammering away at bits of copper. Anyway, this is how stuff gets made. So you have this big supply chain with the first tier and the second tier, and what goes on after that, who knows, in general. But this is making a car in the traditional way, means that you have this system involving many sub-suppliers, many components, and they all get made someplace, transported, assembled, then transported, then assembled someplace else. Then you have the final assembly, then that is shipped off to the distribution, the showroom, then it's shipped off to the consumer, etc. So you have all of these long chains. And at every step of the way, you have opportunities for error, you have the complexity to manage through high precision engineering and quality systems and all of that kind of stuff. You also have impact on the environment through logistics and transport and etc. But this is the traditional manufacturing system, 50,000 pieces. Anyway, this is what the world's first 3D printed car looks like. Now you might say it's ugly. And a lot of people, because they resist change, they will say, oh, I would never buy that. Now you have some crazy guys sitting in it and all his friends are around, they're the ones that made it, etc. And they're just delighted because they've proven the concept. It is possible to make a 3D printed car. And this is just a couple of years after starting a project. It hasn't taken 10 years to get there, it's just a couple of years. Do you know how many components are in this? Less than 50. Less than 50. So the complexity of the object has gone from 25,000 and the huge management effort and overhead down to 50 things that you have to pull together. And if you look at the surface, you might say, oh, that's not so nice. That's true, it's not that nice. It does look, could do with a polish. But that's where we are today. The first car is coming up the line. If you look at the literature, there's a whole discussion. Some people don't like the idea. Others are really excited by what that represents. And our job really is not to dismiss it. Like Steve Ballmer. You know Steve Ballmer? He used to be CEO of Microsoft. He's the guy who used to shout a lot. Yeah, CEO of Microsoft. He once said that the iPhone was a piece of rubbish. He couldn't see anybody buying an iPhone. It would never make a big market. So that was Steve Ballmer. And it's very easy with cognitive bias and local politics of the company to dismiss changes that are going on. And a lot of people will dismiss this. Now, there are not many car companies manufacturing whole cars in that way, but there are a lot of car companies using 3D printing already internally, to make their traditional cars. But let's have a look. Go further and see how far we can go. This is a little buggy, a functional buggy. Say the first car here, you might imagine that this is a town car that somebody wants to drive around in and his kids aren't embarrassed. I know parents and the kids don't want them to pull up in front of the school because they're embarrassed about the car. They want to be dropped off around the corner. But anyway, this is the one that you don't want the kids to be embarrassed with. It's the main family car. But this is something functional that you might have in a yard or drive delivering milk or a taxi around town or whatever. It doesn't have to be beautiful. You don't care. It just has to work. So this is a kind of a stripped down, printed off model. It only took a couple of days actually to design and build. And you might say, well, that's what it looks like. It looks as though it only took a few days. But this is where we're going, and I know that you've seen small printers in action. There's a little film here just to look at a big printer in action, the kind of printer that prints off the body parts for a 3D printed car. I'm trying to get this to work, just a minute.
I'm James Earl with Local Motors. We're 3D printing the car.
In Cincinnati, Ohio, this this industrial-sized 3D printer is in the process of making the shell of an electric car.
The model that we're building is called Stratty. The entire design and build process of the vehicle, from our idea stage in May of this year to printing a car out in September, is only 4 months. A traditional vehicle can take years to do the same thing.
In 2013,
Did you get that? 4 months from starting to design it to printing it out, 4 months, compared to the traditional approach, which would be many years.
a car known as the Irby by Core Ecologic became the first vehicle to have a 3D printed body. It took about 2,500 hours to print. The Stratty by Local Motors took just 44 hours to print at a trade show in Chicago. For these upstarts, it's all about efficiency.
Versus traditional manufacturing, so they take a big piece of metal and machine it down to get a small piece out. And usually their buy-to-fly ratio is 20 to 1. They have to buy 20 pounds more material than they get out of it at the end, out of their usable part at the end. To us, it's very, very close to 1. We only put in as much material as we need. We'll machine off a little bit around the outside, but it's almost 1, which reduces costs overall because you're not wasting all that material.
Local Motors is taking the chassis, seats, door panels, and thousands of other components and 3D printing all those parts into just one piece made of a strong filament consisting of carbon fiber and ABS plastic. Drive components like the engine and wheels are added in later.
A 3D printed car like ours will only have dozens of components versus a traditional car could have thousands or tens of thousands of components. So each one of those components has a tendency for something to go wrong. You have the risk of something to fail, and by reducing the overall complexity, you increase the longevity of your car overall.
Earl estimates that in the near future, a 3D printed car like the Stratty could feasibly cost just $7,000 to manufacture. Despite this low cost, major automakers won't be making the jump from the assembly line to mass-producing 3D printed cars anytime soon.
The difficulty there is you're really only producing one vehicle at a time. And traditionally, there are factories now that are producing hundreds of vehicles a day, but they're working on hundreds of vehicles at a time instead of what we're doing, one vehicle at a time. So it's hard to see in the next 10 or 20 years that that's going to happen, but at the same time, the technology is expanding exponentially. So in 20 years, there may be an entirely new way of 3D printing that is quicker and faster than the way that they're making cars now.
Rick Neff of Cincinnati Incorporated, the maker of the actual printer used by Local Motors, agrees.
I don't think that this technology is going to basically take over what General Motors or Ford is doing today. But I think that Local Motors can have a nice small market segment for mass customized cars, maybe at a premium price that this machine would be fabulous for.
Major automakers have long been taking advantage of 3D printing for design and prototyping in particular. Ford is saving nearly $500,000 in months of production time with just one 3D printed prototype part.
Well, the reason why
You see that? The amount of money saved by traditional manufacturers just in the prototyping. So you have hundreds of thousands of dollars, and many, many months of effort in making a prototype reduced to just days and hours and say a couple of $1,000. So there's really radical savings. The material that they're using, is it's not plastic like in the small, hobby 3D printed. It's a carbon-based complex liquid, So these are the new businesses, really. He mentioned that we don't see General Motors making everything using 3D printed cars. Well, of course not. It's exactly like the power station story. We're not going to close down the power stations, the coal power stations, and replace them with photovoltaics. If General Electric has a production line, that will run for a long time into the future. First of all, there's going to be a demand for that long into the future. The clients who want this kind of a car, it's going to take a long time for that market to actually build up. But in the meantime, there may be other markets, where price is an issue, where time is an issue. And it's in these other markets that the new business will start. And so people will say, oh, it doesn't affect General Electric, it doesn't affect General Electric. Certainly not in a short time, but over several decades. It is affecting General Electric in the sense that they're using this technology in their design, and it will improve design and performance that way. It's a factor of competitiveness. It's a factor in time to market. But that's their competitive histories, their story. Other companies will find totally different markets. People who would never buy a traditional car because they think it's bad for the environment, they might buy a 3D printed car if they think it's good for the environment. There's a whole other, market. Or people who need functional vehicles, they don't care whether it looks good or bad or whatever. In a lumber yard around the farm, whatever, the look doesn't really care, they want functionality. For them, this could be a very interesting option. So when people see this, the reaction tends to be, the resistance is to say, Toyota, Ford, they're not going to put them out of business overnight. No, we're not. But maybe there'll be other businesses, actually independent, that are satisfied by this new technology and the new price and the new service, etc., which Ford could never have addressed because their machines are over-engineered for it or maybe too expensive. So this is the kind of thinking. People will, when you show people the technology, they will push back, and they're right in their pushback. But what they have to do is to try to see the other opportunities, that are out there. And there are also opportunities in the chemistry of the inks. One of the interesting remarks is that if you look at traditional manufacturing, you start with a block of metal and you remove parts of it. You drill it, you cut it, you chop it, and you end up with a much smaller piece of metal, but then the rest is waste. He was saying that it's a factor of 20 to 1. Only 5% of what you end up with. All the rest, the other 95% is thrown away as waste, recycled hopefully, but it's still a lot of work removing all of this material to end up with the final object. But in this case, everything is used.